Ever get that feeling? Like you really want to understand something important, something potentially groundbreaking. But there's just so much information out there. It's overwhelming.
Yeah, I think we all have.
Totally.
That's exactly why we do these deep dives. It's like a shortcut to getting a handle on something really transformative.
Right. Right to the good stuff.
Today, we're going deep on a new way of thinking about innovation in Africa.
Yeah, it's a very different approach than what we've seen before.
We've got some great sources to work with. We have this framework for how to analyze these new approaches, and then this guide for asking the right questions about it all.
And we have a case study all about Rafiki Labs and this venture studio model.
Okay, so what we really want to unpack here is how this venture studio model actually works, especially how Rafiki Labs is using it. The idea is it's supposed to be this founder-focused, context-driven alternative to traditional venture capital in the African tech world.
Exactly. It's about shifting the power dynamic and really centering the founder in the entire process. Right. So let's talk about the challenges. Our case study really lays out some of the systemic issues in Africa's tech ecosystem.
Yeah, it does.
It starts with this over-reliance on external models. Like
Yeah.
there's this almost colonial mindset that solutions developed elsewhere are inherently better. What do you make of that?
Well, almost 77% of startup investment in Africa comes from overseas.
Wow, 77%.
Yeah. So you can see how investment decisions might not always align with African problems, right? It sends a signal that you need external validation.
Makes sense. And that leads right into the second challenge,
Mm.
a lack of context. The sources really emphasize this, like how they bring in these Western accelerator programs and just plop them down without thinking about cultural differences or the realities of the market.
It's like they assume what works in Silicon Valley will magically work everywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. And they even say there's this tendency to value formal education over lived experience, which just seems so backwards.
Completely. It raises the question, like, can you really just transplant these models without any adaptation?
Right, right. And then on top of that, the support systems themselves are all fragmented, all these different incubators, accelerators, and NGOs, but they're all kind of doing their own thing.
Yeah, and founders end up bouncing around from program to program. They're never getting consistent long-term guidance.
Yeah. And I think I remember the case study even said something like, some of these accelerators are just glorified classrooms with curriculum that's totally relevant.
It's about creating a culture of program hopping more than actually building a successful business.
Totally. And then we have to talk about donor influence, right?
Of course.
It seems like because so much funding comes from these international development organizations, their agendas sometimes overshadow what the entrepreneurs really need.
The focus becomes more about pleasing donors and less about building a sustainable business.
So the founders end up chasing grants instead of focusing on their core business and their customers. It's a distraction.
Exactly. Founders might actually become experts in pitching to donor interests rather than focusing on building a business model that works in their community.
Absolutely. And then there's the power dynamic. Feels like a lot of these foreign investors hold all the cards.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very unequal playing field.
The case study almost makes it sound like the local founders are just seen as implementers rather than innovators.
I think that's right. And, the rigid program structures and investor practices that come with that can really undervalue African founders and their ideas.
It's like they're not seen as equal partners.
Right.
Okay, last thing on the challenges. The case study talks about resource gaps and these inherent biases. Like there's this lack of early stage capital from local investors, and there's this focus on trendy tech sectors that fit this Silicon Valley mold.
Yeah, like fintech is hot, but what about agritech or clean energy? What about the stuff that could actually solve the real problems?
Exactly. And then there's this systemic bias where women and Black African founders get a tiny fraction of the funding.
Which means we're missing out on so much potential, so many brilliant ideas never see the light of day.
Totally. Okay, so putting it all together, the argument is that Africa's innovation infrastructure needs a serious overhaul.
100%.
It's got to move away from just copying and pasting and really prioritize local context, founder needs, and long-term impact.
And that's where this program hopping trap comes in, which is what the case study digs into next.
Oh yeah, the program hopping trap. It's this thing where entrepreneurs spend all their time chasing grants and awards. It's like a never-ending grant safari. and they never actually focus on building their business.
Well, and you can see how it happens. These systemic issues push founders away from real problem solving.
Right.
They're constantly tailoring their ideas, rewriting their pitches to fit whatever funding is available.
Even if it means pivoting away from what they were originally passionate about.
Exactly. And it's exhausting, right? You're constantly revising pitches, attending workshops, jumping through hoops just to keep the lights on.
All that time, they could be talking to customers, actually building your product.
Right. And, it creates this tension. Like, yeah, you need money to survive, but you also need to build a sustainable business.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And I thought the case study made a really interesting point about this. It talked about a potentially toxic relationship between donors and support organizations.
You mean?
Well, like the focus becomes on meeting these output metrics instead of actual outcomes.
Oh, I see. So it's all about showing how many people you trained or how many pitch decks you created, not about whether those things actually helped anyone.
Exactly.
And the case study even gives this example of a Nigerian founder who's super passionate about improving crop yields, but ends up getting pushed into fintech.
Yeah, because that's where the money is.
Which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Like, we have this founder who could be solving a real problem, but the system is pushing him in a totally different direction.
Right. It's misaligned incentives all the way down.
Okay, so what are the consequences of all this? The case study points out that despite the hype, total venture capital investment in Africa is still a tiny percentage of global investment.
Yeah, and a lot of startups don't even make it past the prototype stage.
And outside of a few fintech unicorns, there haven't been many successful exits.
Which makes it even harder to attract investment. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. And on top of that, the funding that does exist is really unevenly distributed.
Both geographically and socially. Certain regions and certain types of founders just get left behind.
Okay, so the takeaway here is that we need a fundamental shift. We need to stop trying to force fit these external models and start embracing solutions that are built for the African context.
And solutions that prioritize developing local talent.
Right. And that brings us to this question: does the Western playbook even work in Africa? The case study really pushes back on this idea that there's one right way to do things.
Yeah, I mean, look at growth expectations. Western VCs want to see that hockey stick growth, right?
Yeah, like everything's going to explode overnight.
But in many African markets, growth is much slower and more linear. You're dealing with infrastructure limitations, different consumer behaviors.
Right, so this pressure to scale super fast can actually be really detrimental.
Totally. And then you have all these copy-paste solutions, the Uber for X model.
The case study basically says that's a recipe for disaster because it doesn't take local context into account.
Exactly. You have to adapt to things like lower smartphone penetration or the fact that there might already be a strong informal economy that's meeting those needs.
Okay, one more thing on this. The case study talks about how even the metrics used to evaluate these programs can be misaligned. Like, they look at things like how much capital a startup raised or their follow-on funding rate. But those metrics don't always tell the whole story.
Absolutely. They favor founders who already have access to resources and networks, and they neglect startups that are solving important local problems but maybe don't need as much capital or don't grow as quickly.
Right, so the metrics themselves are reinforcing these existing inequalities.
Exactly. And then there's this aid paradox, which I thought was so interesting.
What's that?
The idea that these donor-funded programs can actually create a mindset that's more about aid delivery than entrepreneurship.
So instead of thinking like a startup founder who's trying to build a business, they're thinking like an NGO project manager.
Exactly. I think the case study even joked about founders becoming professional proposal writers.
Which, is kind of sad because it's taking them away from actually building a business.
Yeah. So it seems like while learning from global best practices is important, blindly applying them doesn't work.
It's about adaptation.
Right. It's about figuring out what works in the African context. And that's where this venture studio model comes in as a potential solution.
Okay, Venture Studios. I'm excited to learn more about this.
Yeah, so to really get it, we need to compare it to the traditional VC model.
Okay, so traditional VC, you have a founder, they have an idea, they build something, and then they go out and raise money.
And then they're mostly on their own, right? Maybe they get some mentorship, but they're expected to execute.
Right. And venture capital firms are betting on a lot of different companies, knowing that most of them will fail.
Right.
Okay, so how is the venture studio model different?
Well, with a venture studio, they're not just providing capital. They're actually involved in building the startups from the ground up.
So they're more like co-founders.
Exactly. They have this in-house expertise, and they provide operational support across all the different functions.
So they're way more hands-on.
Much more.
Okay, I see. The case study highlights some key differences. The timing of the involvement is way earlier for studios,
Yeah, they're there from day one, basically.
and the scope of support is much broader. It's not just money, it's product development, go-to-market strategy, everything.
Right, and the risk and ownership is more balanced. The studio's taking on more risk, but they're also getting a bigger share of the company.
Makes sense. And because they're so involved, they're working closely with the startup on a daily basis.
It's a true partnership.
I like that. I remember the case study even called it a sandbox to fail fast and iterate effectively.
Yeah, it's a safe space to experiment.
Okay, the case study gives a couple of examples. You have Slow Ventures with their creator fund.
Yeah, so they're a VC firm, but they're trying to be more founder-centric, especially within the creator economy. They're taking a longer-term view, which is interesting.
And then you have Rafiki Labs, which is a pure venture studio.
Right. They proactively identify local problems and then they build ventures to solve them.
Using their RDG framework, which is research, development, and growth.
Exactly. And, it's really what we do at Rafiki Labs, too. We go out, we talk to hundreds of people, we figure out what the gaps and opportunities are, and then we support the winners.
It's like a very intentional way of building an ecosystem.
Absolutely. It's about making sure the right solutions get built, the right companies get funded.
Okay, so what kind of outcomes are we seeing from this venture studio model? The case study says it's pretty promising.
Yeah, the early data is really encouraging. Startups that come out of venture studios tend to raise money faster and exit faster.
And I remember this modeling by FutureSight that said studios can create 10 times as much value.
It's not just about the money they invest, it's about the operational support, the strategic guidance they provide.
Okay, so it sounds like the venture studio model really addresses a lot of the challenges we were talking about earlier.
Definitely. It provides patient capital, it focuses on local problems, it allows for resource sharing across different startups.
And it's founder first.
Exactly. It's designed to make the entrepreneur successful.
The case study talks about how they do this. First, they really emphasize empathy in problem selection.
So it's not about chasing the latest trend, it's about going out and really understanding what people need.
Deep research, talking to customers.
Right. And then they provide this end-to-end support. So founders don't have to jump from program to program.
Like a one-stop shop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because the studios are so involved, they can really customize their approach to the local context.
They get it.
They do. And they invest in capacity building. It's not just about building a company. It's about making sure the founders have the skills they need to succeed.
It's about empowering them.
Right. And then there's the financial support. Sometimes they'll even give founders a salary so they can focus on the business.
Which is huge. It takes a lot of pressure off.
Totally. And then finally, they work to build these collaborative ecosystems. They partner with corporations, universities, government initiatives.
So everyone's working together.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about Rafiki Labs and their RDG model. It sounds like a very systematic way to do this whole venture studio thing.
Yeah, it's about breaking the process down into manageable stages.
So you have the research phase, which is all about understanding the problem, doing that deep analysis.
Right, getting that foundation right.
And then development, where you're building the prototypes, testing things out.
Rapid iteration.
And then growth, where you're scaling the business, going to market. But what's really interesting is how Rafiki Labs uses AI throughout this whole process.
Yeah, they're using AI to amplify their impact and make everything more efficient.
So in the research phase, they're using AI to analyze market data, understand consumer sentiment. They even have this AI mentor that can answer questions and summarize information.
It's like giving every founder access to a world-class research team.
That's awesome. And then in the development phase, they're using AI for things like code generation, graphic design, even building basic app prototypes.
It speeds up the whole process. You can test your ideas so much faster.
And then in the growth phase, they're using AI for pitch refinement, investor Q&A simulation, chatbots, data analytics.
All this stuff that would normally take a huge team and tons of money.
Yeah, it's amazing. So it sounds like by combining the venture studio model with AI, Rafiki Labs is creating this high-throughput, context-sensitive startup factory.
Exactly. They're addressing the scalability and cost concerns while still making sure everything is relevant to the African context.
And they use this example of a South African entrepreneur who's building a logistics platform. It really shows how much easier the journey can be with a venture studio, especially with AI.
It's night and day compared to the traditional path.
Okay, so big picture, the case study suggests that this combination of venture studios and AI could be a new blueprint for innovation infrastructure, not just in Africa, but everywhere.
I think they're right. It's about shifting the focus to the founder, making sure they have the support they need to succeed.
It's about contextualization at scale, building solutions that are truly made for the local context.
And building these integrated support networks where everyone's working together.
And it's about taking a long-term view, investing in sustainable growth.
Right. And AI makes it all more cost-effective and scalable.
It's a really exciting model. It has the potential to attract more investment, build stronger partnerships, and create real impact.
And it's a model that we believe in deeply at Rafiki Labs. It's what drives us.
So as we wrap up, I think it's clear that the venture studio model, especially with AI, has the potential to revolutionize Africa's innovation ecosystem.
It's about moving away from these fragmented approaches and imported models and really embracing something that's built for Africa, by Africa.
It's about empowering founders,
It's about building solutions that matter.
and it's about leveraging technology to make it all happen.
And it makes you think, right? Like, where else could this model be applied? What other problems could we solve if we took this approach?
That's the question I want our listeners to think about. It's not just about funding ideas, it's about building them. And it's about doing it in a way that's sustainable, impactful, and truly transformative.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.